Due to the themes of this podcast, listener discretion is advised. Lock your doors, close the blinds, change your passwords. This is Secrets and Spies. Secrets and Spies is a podcast that dives into the world of espionage, terrorism, geopolitics, and intrigue. This podcast is produced and hosted by Chris Carr.
On today's podcast, I'm joined by Pulitzer Prize-winning author, journalist, and historian Anne Applebaum, and we discuss her latest book, Autocracy Inc., which gives a detailed look at the assaults by autocrats everywhere, both overt and covert, on liberal democracies and open societies. I've been wanting to get Anne on the podcast for quite some time, so I'm really looking forward to sharing this interview. I hope you enjoy it as much as I enjoyed recording it. Just before we begin, if you're enjoying this podcast, please consider supporting us directly by becoming a Patreon subscriber. All you need to do is just go to patreon.com/secrets and spies. And depending on which level you pick, you'll get a free coaster or coffee cup. And also you'll get access to our Patreon exclusive show, Extra Shot, which comes out twice a month after every espresso martini. I hope you enjoy this episode. Take care.
The opinions expressed by guests on Secrets and Spies do not necessarily represent those of the producers and sponsors of this podcast.
And welcome to the podcast. For the benefit of listeners not familiar with you and your work, please can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm Anne Applebaum. I'm a historian and writer. I wrote several books about Soviet and East European history, history of the Gulag, history of the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe, history of the Ukrainian famine. I'm also a reporter. I write about U.S. and European politics, and I've just written a new book called Autocracy Inc.
Yeah, which is what we're here to talk about today, which is a great book. So who or what is Autocracy Inc?
So the book describes a network. It's not an alliance. It's not an axis. We're not in a Cold War with it. It's a network of countries who don't necessarily have anything in common ideologically, but who work together around certain things. Russia, Iran, China, North Korea, plus others, Belarus, Zimbabwe, others around the world. There are some states that cooperate with them sometimes and sometimes don't.
Yes.
But in essence, they're a group of countries who seek to maintain their power and maintain their regime stability, partly through their use of money and partly through their desire to fight back and undermine us and against to undermine our language. And I'm sure we'll talk about that more.
Well, yeah. Why do autocracies seek to undermine democracy? Kind of what are they afraid of?
Mostly they're afraid of their own domestic opposition. So whether it was the Navalny movement in Russia, which talked about corruption and demanded transparency and justice, or whether it was the Hong Kong movement that demanded democracy and a lighter touch from the Communist Party, or whether it's Iranian women's movement, which demands an end to theocracy and the forced veil. These are all movements that use the language of civic organization. They talk about freedom. They talk about transparency. They talk about justice. They talk about the rule of law, and those are very popular ideas in those countries. And they have a deep appeal to people who live in brutal dictatorships. And the regimes understand that. And so their aim, first of all, has always been to crush and undermine those ideas inside their own countries. But increasingly, as the world becomes more global and as the people are able to move around, they also want to undermine those ideas wherever they appear. And so they have begun a kind of they've begun to seek to use authoritarian narratives, not just inside Russia or China, but also to promote them in Africa and Latin America, but also even in the United States.
Yeah, well, how does that sort of online propaganda work? What kind of techniques are they using?
I mean, some of it's not really a matter of techniques. I mean, so the Chinese, for example, have spent a huge amount of money buying media for example, in Africa, television stations, but also they have content sharing agreements with a lot of countries. So some of it is just that they all of them have their own networks, their own broadcasting systems, their own radio, and so on. Of course, they have that often in many, many languages. But they also have a couple of other things they do. So the Russians are particularly good at creating media properties or websites that look native, that look like they're whatever, Peruvian or South African, but are in fact Russian and are used to launder Russian propaganda. This is called information laundering. So people reading them don't think they're reading Russian propaganda, but actually that's what it is. The Chinese do have a version of this, which also involves outreach to journalists and, as I said, content sharing agreements so that Chinese material will often appear in a native language or in a local market and elsewhere in the world. And so they have really a pretty big network of media properties, both legitimate and illegitimate, that they speak through. Of course, all of them use social media as well. I mean, I think since 2016, everybody's been familiar with the concept of Russian trolling and Russian anonymous online campaigns, which they do on Twitter and Facebook and Telegram and many other forms of media. Anywhere where there's anonymity is allowed, where people can anonymously post, they take advantage of it, and those are the tactics. But there's also there's a strategy as well, and the strategy is about creating an authoritarian narrative. It's about creating an idea that autocracies and dictatorships are more stable, they're safer. They respond to what people really want, which is traditional society or sometimes traditional morality. And they seek to undermine democracies as chaotic, as violent, as dangerous, as unfair, but also as degenerate. I mean, literally sexually degenerate and morally degenerate. And they seek to make that contrast all the time, so that they so that they consolidate a set of ideas around themselves, and then sometimes they seek to do the same in the United States. So in Europe and America, they've targeted very carefully the far right, and it's very, very hard to tell when you're dealing with a far right German troll or is he a Russian troll, because they use the same language, they have the same ideas, same metaphors, and they all borrow the same memes and the same pictures and the same ideas from one another. So that's been that's a big part of what they do, both inside their own countries and around the world.
Yeah, and I'm interested by that sort of appeal to the far right and even far left as well of Western cultures.
Yep.
Can you talk to us a little bit about sort of that commonality that seems to appeal to the far left and the far right?
I mean, the far left and the far right in democracies are united by their dislike of their own political systems. Sometimes they have a slightly different reason for why they dislike them, whether it's, whether it's capitalist domination or whether it's, whether it's dislike of multiculturalism and ethnic diversity, whatever. There can be different reasons for it, but they very much dislike their own countries. They seek to overthrow or undermine them. Sometimes they even use the language of revolution. The American right has started using the language of revolution. The head of the Heritage Foundation, which is a long-standing, once upon a time conservative think tank, recently said in an interview that, there was a revolution coming and it would be bloodless as long as the left allowed it to be, whatever that means. So so increasingly they talk about overthrowing or changing or altering the system. I mean, J.D. Vance, who's just been named as Donald Trump's vice presidential candidate, is somebody who's talked pretty openly on numerous occasions about very radical changes that would, eliminate, fire everybody in the federal government and replace them with loyalists. Ideas that you would expect to hear in an illiberal or autocratic regime that had just taken power. So the far right has borrowed a lot from the autocratic world, and I think seeks to imitate it.
Yeah, indeed. And you see a lot of open far-right support for Putin, especially in regards to the war on Ukraine.
Yes, I mean that's because the people who read the, who are part of the network that reads material that originates in Russia also reads lies about Ukraine. I mean, one of the extraordinary things about Ukraine is how really quite blatant lies. I mean, for example, there was a story about President Zelensky owning yachts. President Zelensky doesn't own any yachts, but there was a thing about how he owns 2 very big yachts and so on. And that story was, I think it was Mitch McConnell. I may be misremembering, but I know that one Republican senator said that he had heard his colleagues citing that story in arguments on the Senate floor. In other words, American senators are now part of networks that pick up these fake stories about Ukraine and use them in oral arguments. So it's now a very, very successful way to get false information into people's heads, is by attracting them to these autocratic networks and narratives and then using that to do Russian propaganda. So, and that's, you can see the effect of it. I mean, you can see the effect on Vance and on Trump and on other American politicians as well.
Yeah, well, let's talk a little bit more about that. How do autocracies use conspiracy theories, political cynicism, and apathy to their advantage? And kind of what's the goal of all that?
Well, the ultimate goal, I mean, one of the things that you achieve by lying all the time, and by lying in a way that everybody knows it's lying, or by lying in a contradictory way. So whenever something happens, there will be multiple different explanations, but that actually happened on the day after the assassination attempt against Donald Trump. There were dozens of different explanations. It was a left-wing plot. It was a Biden administration plot. And you heard this coming from different people in politics, not just from trolls, but from members of Congress. And one of the effects of all that is that it makes a lot of people say, I don't want to watch television anymore, and I don't want to be involved in politics, and I don't want to listen to any of this because I have no way of knowing what's true, and also it's very ugly and confusing. And if you can get people out of politics, if you can remove them from the public sphere, if you can convince them that there's nothing to be achieved there, and that they can't have any influence, and it's impossible to know what's true and what's not true, then you're on a path in the direction of autocracy, because that's what autocrats do. They don't want the public involved in politics. They want them out. They want to control the public sphere themselves and to dominate the economy and to dominate the political sphere without the intervention of ordinary people. And and you can see that beginning to happen, I think, especially in the United States, actually, but there's versions of it in a lot of European countries too.
Oh yeah, I see it. I mean, I'm in my early 40s, technically middle-aged now, but I noticed a lot of people of my generation who kind of grew up in the 90s, apathy was quite big, and then people 10 years younger than me and even 20 years younger than me, apathy is huge, and a lot of people don't watch the news anymore, don't like to be informed, and try and find every way possible to escape reality. And I think it does unfortunately seem to be working, and youth voter turnout is very low now, especially in the UK and to some extent the US.
Yeah, I mean, it's been successful, and actually in the one or two examples of moments when an autocratic regime has been, or an illiberal party has been taken out of office, a lot of times it happens because of a big turnout. There was a election in Poland in October. There they'd had a government that had been for 8 years slowly undermining institutions. And they were finally evicted, mostly because of an election that produced an enormous turnout. So millions more people than usually vote. I think it was something like 73% turnout, and in the cities it was 85%. So it was a very big vote, and that was instrumental in changing the country and in removing the sort of autocratic populist ruling party. So the public involvement and civic engagement is part of what is needed to push back against these kinds of changes. But of course, that's precisely what autocratic and illiberal leaders don't want.
Well, yeah. I mean, in your book, you say that we should undermine the information war rather than sort of fight it. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Well, I think I just meant that it's, simply fact-checking, simply saying, no, that's not true, doesn't help. I mean, it's been pretty clear that there's no longer, because the fact-checkers themselves don't have authority among among people, and they aren't necessarily believed. Although I should say, in Brazil, there was a fact-checking political movement. I mean, they people organized almost a kind of political party or political movement around the idea of fact-checking and around the idea of establishing the truth. So you can imagine a way in which you could empower people who did that to, or people could create a larger, a larger sense of momentum around doing that if you had the right people doing it. But I think one of the things that we can do is begin to expose how some of this works. I mean, if you can tell people, if you can teach people how to understand what they read, if you can explain how, in some cases, we've been successful. For example, the U.S. has been successful in exposing some of these information laundering operations. So websites and other news outlets that aren't real, when they're exposed as not real, and when that's communicated in the right way to enough people, you can take away some of their power. So there are things that can be done. I mean, I think people who want to be as truthful as possible and who want to reach, and attain some kind of engagement, need to also think about how they use emotion and how they use even emotions like optimism and hope and an idea about the future, how they communicate that to people in a way that brings them back into the conversation. So there are a lot of different ways of thinking about how to do it.
Yeah, and it's an interesting time we're in at the moment as well, because traditional media, trust in it does appear to be kind of in a decline, and at the same time, a lot of traditional media is becoming kind of more corporatized, and it's sort of getting harder and harder for people to sort of be able to reliably turn to those sources without, and a lot of people sort of will point to any media bias as an example of, well, you shouldn't trust that sourcing. How do we navigate that? Because it's quite a kind of complicated area.
Well, first of all, the undermining of media is an authoritarian project. There are people who've been seeking to do it deliberately and on purpose, as a way of creating a veil of untransparency around themselves. I mean, this is what Donald Trump has done for the last 8 or even 10 years. By constantly attacking the media, he's neutered the stories, the true stories about him, whether it's financial shenanigans or rape or other forms of misbehavior, and that's why he does what he does, is to deliberately undermine. And there's a version of that Nigel Farage does in the UK. So it's not it's something you can see in a lot of countries. I would also say that there's another thing going on, which is that media are genuinely weaker than they were because the business model of media has been undermined. And it's not wrong to say that some media outlets that were better, a decade ago are worse now. And so I think there's a combination of finding a way to support them. I mean, I think a lot of it's going to have to be done through philanthropy or foundations, and finding a way of, for those outlets to reconnect with people, whether it's through becoming forms of civic engagement themselves. I mean, I know that the magazine I work for, The Atlantic, thinks a lot about how to create a community around The Atlantic, or how to bring people in and talk to them and create events for them and offer them something other than just a magazine subscription. And the media outlets that have been most successful are the ones that can do that.
Yes.
The New York Times does it a little bit, and so thinking about what media is, I think it's not just, I mean, of course you're reporting the news and you're saying what happened yesterday, but you also need to think about how you're reaching people and how they're hearing it. And some media is better at that than others.
Yeah, indeed. Well, let's take a quick break and then we'll be right back. Well, America and Europe are not the only targets of autocratic states. So how do they target other parts of the world, such as Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East? And what kind of talking points do they use?
So Africa and the Middle East are both, and South America, I should say, are major targets for Russia, for China, and for Iran, as well as for other local or regional autocracies. The Chinese consider Africa to be very important. They have, as I said, they have this huge media network there. They have a huge investment network there. Their way of investing is very often conducive to autocratic regimes. They'll invest in a project and there'll be a kickback to politicians. They're not overly concerned about corruption, and much of what they do has the effect of entrenching people who are in power. And some of the kind of investment they do is also, a country will borrow a lot of money to build a bridge or build a highway. They won't be able to pay it back, and then the Chinese will take possession of those properties. And there have been some instances of that. So a lot of what they do is not necessarily good for the country, but maybe it's good for the people who took the bribes or who set up the deal, and so some of that helps. I mean, the Russians have a much more aggressive and frankly old-fashioned way of intervening in Africa, which is they have the Wagner mercenaries who became famous for their work in Ukraine, are active all over Africa, but particularly in West Africa and the Sahel, and they help. It's almost like there's a kind of playbook. I mean, they'll go to dictators, or military leaders, and they'll say, you want to stay in power or you want to gain power, employ us, we'll help you. And then Wagner mercenaries will come and help them fight off their enemies. And in return, give us a diamond mine, or give us a gold mine. And so there's quite a lot of evidence of this. I mean, I'm talking about it very generally here, but the deal is that then Wagner will control some kind of resources, and they'll have special access, and they'll be able to export whatever materials it is, whether it's gold or gems or something else. And that's their arrangement. I mean, it's a kind of almost primitive colonial arrangement. It's almost, I don't know, kind of Clive of India stuff. We'll bring in some mercenaries, we'll beat up your enemies. In exchange, we're gonna steal your resources. And so that's what they do. And again, it works because there are regimes in West Africa who want that. I mean, they'd rather have that than some UN people telling them what to do, and they'd rather. And that's, I'm guessing there will eventually be more of a pushback to that than there is now. But right now, it's they get away with it. I mean, generally speaking, one of the big ideas of the book is that for a lot of autocratic regimes, it makes sense to support their colleagues. Whether it's the leaders of Russia supporting the leaders of Venezuela, whether it's the Chinese investing in Venezuela, there's that they see one another. So we tend to look at the world as these kind of geographic bubbles. We have Middle East experts, and we have Central American experts, and we have African experts, but they don't see the world that way. They see it as connected, and they are interested in doing deals and having alliances and economic relationships with like-minded dictators in other places. And that explains a lot of Russian or Chinese or indeed Iranian foreign policy.
No, indeed. How can we, I suppose in a sense, better train Western students of foreign policy to sort of look at the world in a more whole way rather than just in separate sort of regions like you just described?
I mean, I didn't know that you need a special program. You simply need to talk about it in that way. I mean, that one of the points of me writing this book, which, as you know, is a very short book. It's just an essay, really.
Yeah.
Is to provoke those kinds of conversations. How do we start looking at these relationships and not just talking about having a Russia policy or a China policy? How do we have a policy towards the Russian-Chinese alliance? The Russians have proved to be very good at dodging certain kinds of sanctions and export controls because of their relationship with Russia, because of their relationship with Turkey, and especially Iran, and North Korea, who've been supplying the Russians with ammunition. So they, I think simply, once you start seeing that, once you begin to see their relationships, it's hard to unsee them, because it explains so much of how particularly the weaker regimes manage to stay in power. I mean, the Belarusian dictator is profoundly unpopular. He would not win a free election. Maduro, the Venezuelan dictator, profoundly unpopular. He would not win a free election. They're in power because they've been helped out by these other states. And as I said, identifying that and understanding it would help us understand the world a lot better. And you don't need like international relations theory or, observing the world as it is and watching what they do and putting together some of the stories. I mean, one of the other things about this book was, while I was writing it, I realized that almost everything has been written already. In other words, a lot of my material comes from think tank reports or other government reports or sometimes academic research or journalism. There are people who've been telling parts of the story, and it's all the material's available. It's not like it's a secret. I mean, I met somebody who was an expert on the relationship between Iran and Venezuela. Two countries that have nothing in common culturally or historically or anything else, except that they're both under sanctions. They both produce oil, and they help one another out. And so his expertise was there. It's just a question of putting it together and understanding how common these patterns are and how they work.
Yeah, so I've been careful not to sort of silo that sort of information. Now, many commentators like to kind of say the current situation between democracies and autocracies is sort of akin to a new Cold War. What do you think or feel about that analogy?
So I dislike that analogy because the Cold War implies that there are two blocks. They each have a clear ideology. There's some kind of geographic divide between them. There's the Berlin Wall that separates one half from the other half. And I don't think it works like that anymore. As I've said already, the autocratic alliance is not based on ideology. It's based on some common interests. And they have in other areas, they have different interests, and and lines can be drawn between them. And they also have an enormous amount of influence inside the democratic world. I mean, there are, as we just talked about, the far right is effectively no different uses the same language as the Russians do. And the reverse is also true. I mean, there are very big democratic movements inside the autocratic world, and we should be aligned with them. And we should listen to them also, by the way, because they often understand those states and how they operate a lot better than anyone else. I mean, the Russian opposition understood the degree to which the regime was dependent on Western financial institutions before anybody in the West was really paying attention to that. They've been talking about it for years. That was what Alexei Navalny was most famous for doing. So it's a bit more porous. I mean, it's not like we can geographically separate these two groups, because there are autocratic movements inside our own societies, which are very powerful. I mean, one of them controls the American Republican Party now.
Well, what can be done to tackle these sort of autocratic leanings in the UK, Europe, and America?
A lot of politicians are seeking the answer to that. I mean, Keir Starmer and the people around him think about that a lot, actually. I mean, I didn't know that the UK was threatened with autocracy, but they certainly think about populism. And they talk a lot about how I was just in Britain just in the run up to the election. And a lot of people who work for Labour are thinking about what are we going to do? They see the next threat as a kind of populist movement. How do we head it off? And there are people who think they have economic answers. If we can make changes to the economy, if we can make it more fair, if we can involve more people, so there's an economic answer, but there may also be a cultural answer. As I said, in Poland, part of the answer, in an election that was won against autocratic populists, part of the answer was to do with motivating people to vote or finding ways to re-engage people who'd been put off by politics. So there are different answers in different countries. I mean, I actually thought the Biden campaign in 2020 was a pretty good anti-populist campaign. Biden talked a lot about ordinary people. I remember an ad he made that was about ordinary people trying to get through their day. All we want to do is help you do that. And we know that you go to work in order to take care of your families, and we want to be partners, something like that. And I thought that was very effective. It was what is the role of government? The role of government is to help you a bit and not, terrorize you or frighten you or create culture wars, that involve you. And so there is campaigning language. I mean, it's also true that we have, in these profoundly unequal societies that we live in, the space for the feelings of unfairness or feelings of exclusion are easier, and finding some way to end that would help. And then I've been saying for years that there are ways to regulate social media that I don't even know if it's worth talking about anymore, because it's so far away from reality that nobody seems willing to do it. Maybe the European Union will do it, but it's you have to be willing to take on some of the platforms, and whether it's regulating algorithms or just demanding transparency, nobody seems willing to do it right now. But that's obviously has to be part of the solution.
Yeah, indeed. Well, on a more sort of personal level, what can listeners listening to us chatting today do to both protect themselves from anti-democratic propaganda and also sort of tackle the growing power of Autocracy Inc?
You mean other than read my book?
Well, other than read it, but I mean, read your book, which should be number one, definitely. And your articles too, they're very good. Subscribe to The Atlantic, that was part one.
Subscribe to The Atlantic, exactly, right. No, I mean, I think it's understanding where your information is coming from, and being conscious all the time of who's producing it, asking yourself when you hear a story, does it come from an organization that at least tries to fact check, that at least that has some rules about reporting, or does it come from, your cousin who might be making it up? Thinking very hard about what kind of information you believe. I think having a role, whether it's just inside your community or in a political campaign, or if you're in the U.S. working for an election, or in a polling booth, thinking about what role you can personally play. I mean, I found that during the 2020 election, which was in some ways a strange moment, it was because it was the middle of the pandemic. People were very panicky and anxious. And a lot of people, and I told a lot of people, if you feel panicky and anxious, it's partly because you feel helpless. You can't do anything. And so sometimes it helps to just do something. Who is the local candidate in your state Senate election? Or who is or is there a local polling booth you can work in? Or is there something that you can do that makes you feel engaged? Or I don't know, maybe it doesn't even have to be political. I mean, just be some form of community engagement. I think that helps people a lot feel connected to other people with the same concerns. And ultimately that's what it's those kinds of independent civic organizations and people who work for them that autocrats seek to push back against, and making sure that you're not a victim of that propaganda, I think is very important.
Yeah, I think finding that human connection is very important, because it's very easy to read the internet and think everybody hates you, or you can hate everybody. But when you start meeting everybody, you start to realize actually things are not quite like you see.
Yeah, I mean, the online world is horrible. The online world is, think about it. If you're in a room and somebody walked in with a mask on and started shouting at you, what would you say? You would say, "Get out." I mean, why? What right do you have to talk to me? You have a mask on. I don't even know who you are. But on the internet, anonymous people shout at you and you get upset. Why? I mean, you should just block them, or I don't know, move on. But I've thought for a long time that the anonymity is the crux of the problem, at least on the mainstream social media, on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. But I don't think, actually, in Instagram, it's hard to be anonymous. But.
Yeah. I think, am I right in thinking Estonia, with their digital citizenship, have sort of addressed that a little bit to counter?
Yeah. I mean, there's a whole nother set of interesting issues, which is, could there be more creative ways of using the internet to have political debate, or there's any debate, it doesn't have to be political. And there are some experiments with it. So the Taiwanese, for example, have occasionally have big public discussions using a kind of bespoke internet platform whose algorithm is designed to pull together people with similar views, so that and to look for compromises. I mean, there are ways in which we could use, if we were creative, we could use technology to debate and discuss the world in a way that doesn't, turn into chaos. I mean, remember that the existing big social media companies, their algorithms are based on what travels the fastest is whatever's the most emotional, sometimes the angriest, and sometimes the most divisive material, and so priority goes to people who are good at that, who are good at anger and emotion. And a social media platform that didn't prioritize that, but instead prioritized, rational debate might solve some of the problem. But those are, as I said, I 2 or 3 years ago, I worked on a project where we looked at all these different ways you might reform the internet and what would the alternatives to the platforms be. And I wrote with a colleague, Peter Pomerantsev, we wrote a big piece about it. And then I slowly realized that nobody wants to deal with it, and people are afraid of it. And a lot of our politicians aren't technically competent to understand it, and it disappeared. I mean, there's kind of a moment when people started to talk about it, but now it feels impossible. I know politicians would have to care, and they don't.
Yeah, it's true. It's a very complicated area, especially in America, because there's obviously the First Amendment issues. But then you've got a lot of these tech companies, I'm talking a bit widely here, but a lot of them tend to be run by libertarians who seem to be these free speech absolutists and don't seem to really understand.
Except that they're not free speech absolutists. I mean, Elon Musk describes himself as that, but he's perfectly happy to censor Twitter on behalf of the Indian government, which he has done. And he's also perfectly willing to manipulate and promote lies and conspiracy theories. So that's all fake. I mean, the free speech thing is entirely false.
Oh yeah, totally. And how do we navigate that? Because it again, like Facebook, it famously in 2016. It was a platform that was allowed to pump a lot of disinformation, and the tech companies seem very slow and almost a bit unwilling to really take responsibility for this.
Yep, they were. I mean, they've gone in different directions since then. I mean, I think Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram and Threads, has tried to downplay political and even information and journalism altogether, so that they don't even really appear on the site, which has its other side effect, which is it was through those platforms that people were getting journalism, and now they don't get it. And Twitter's done the same, I should say. And at the same time, Twitter has become worse. It's a there's a clear presence of both people who do active disinformation, but as well as Russian and other states have clearly trying to manipulate algorithms and spread false narratives there, and that doesn't seem to be a priority anymore. I mean, there may be an EU pushback against Twitter, because the EU I think might be the only institution in the world that could control it, because that's what they do. They regulate things. They think a lot about regulation, and also these aren't their companies. So in the U.S., it's difficult because these are American companies, and they have a lot of influence in Congress, and they have, Silicon Valley is very powerful in lots of ways and gives a lot of money to politics, and so it's harder there. It may be that the EU is able to do it at later down the road. I know they talk about it a lot, but anyway, we'll see.
Yeah. We'll have to keep an eye on that. Well, Anne, before you go, is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up today?
I think it's important, if you're going to read the book, to remember that it's a first draft kind of argument. I'm trying to describe what's something that's emerging. I don't have all the answers, and I don't have not every fact that would prove my thesis is in the book. And I'm hoping that people pay attention to the story. How do autocracies work? How do they work together? How do they influence us? And that other people take it farther. So please think of the book as an introduction to the subject.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, where can listeners sort of find out more about you and your other work, and obviously more about the book?
Well, I have a website, which is anneapplebaum.com. You can read me in The Atlantic. I publish fairly regularly. I have a Substack, which is maybe not as I only started it recently, and I have to juggle it with my Atlantic work, but I do publish on that, and I think a lot of my new work will be available on that. So, and that's, I don't know, it's anneapplebaum.substack.com or something. So it's very easy to find. And I've written several other books in the past, which you can look up. Twilight of Democracy was published in 2020 as another short book that was more focused on decline of Western democracies as opposed to the autocratic world. And then, my other books, as I said, are mostly history books, but history is also important. So I know there are lots of places to find me if you search not very hard. So
cool. Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.